The glass was still in my hand when the string lights above the courtyard began to swim. Not blur, swim. As if the 100 small bulbs strung between the oak posts had come loose from their wires and were floating, slow and deliberate, through the September dark. I remember thinking, quite clearly, that this was not normal. I remember thinking it in the calm, distant way you think things about someone else's body. And then I understood, with a cold drop in my stomach, that the body was mine. 211 guests stood in the courtyard of Larkspur Hill Vineyards that night, glasses lifted, waiting for me to finish a toast I had given, in one form or another, every September for 11 years. 20 years since my grandmother Eleanor planted the first 3 acres with her own hands. 20 years since she turned a stubborn, rocky hillside that everyone told her was worthless into something that would outlive her. I had the microphone. I had the words memorized. And somewhere between "To Eleanor" and "To all of you," the floor of the world tilted sideways and did not come back. Something is wrong, I thought. Something is very wrong. I have relived that moment so many times since that I can tell you the exact temperature of the air. 61 degrees. I can tell you that the band had just finished a slow number and the violinist was lowering her bow. I can tell you that my daughter Emma was standing 11 feet to my left in a green dress, and that she was the first person whose face changed, because she was the only person in that courtyard who was actually looking at me instead of performing for the cameras. The glass slipped from my hand at 8:47 p.m. I know the time because it is stamped, mercilessly and forever, on 400 phones that were recording the toast when I went down. I did not fall gracefully. There is no dignity in a body giving out from under you in front of 200 people who paid $300 a plate to watch you succeed. My knee buckled first. Then my shoulder found the corner of the podium. Somewhere, a glass shattered that was not mine, and someone screamed, and a band stopped playing mid-note in a way that left a strange, ringing silence hanging over the vines. The last clear thing I remember is my brother's face. Not shocked, not afraid. Ready. Preston was already moving before I hit the ground, which is the kind of detail you only notice in hindsight, when you have had months to take the evening apart frame by frame, like a woman disassembling a clock to find the one gear that was filed down on purpose. He did not rush to catch me. He rushed to be seen rushing to catch me, which is an entirely different thing. And if you have ever had a sibling who mastered the art of performing love in front of witnesses while withholding it in private, you already know exactly what I mean. "She's not well," Preston said, loudly enough for the nearest table to hear, his hand closing around my wrist in a grip that was not gentle. "She hasn't been well for months. I told you all this was too much for her." I want you to notice that sentence. I want you to hold on to it, because it did not come from nowhere. Preston did not improvise those words in a moment of panic over his collapsing sister. He recited them. And a man does not recite a sentence unless he has rehearsed it. My mother arrived next, and my mother has always understood the value of an audience better than any actress I have ever seen. Diane Ashworth wept beautifully. She wept in a way that made 3 separate women reach out to touch her arm in comfort, even as her own daughter lay on cold flagstone with a shattered wine glass 6 inches from her hand. "My poor girl," Diane said, and her voice cracked exactly where a voice is supposed to crack. "She's been under so much strain. The vineyard, the debts, losing David. It's finally caught up with her." Losing David. My husband had been dead 6 years. My mother invoked his memory over my half-conscious body like a woman laying flowers on a grave she had dug herself. I could not speak. I want to be honest with you about that, because there is no version of this story where I want you to believe I was some quiet, composed observer lying peacefully on the ground while my family orchestrated my downfall. I was frightened. My tongue felt thick and foreign in my mouth. The lights kept swimming. And underneath the fear, in a small, cold room at the very back of my mind, a single thought was forming with perfect, terrible clarity. They did this. I did not know yet how. I did not know yet why, not fully, not in the specific and devastating detail I would come to learn over the following months. But I knew, the way you know a storm has already broken even before the first drop of rain touches your skin, that what was happening to me in that courtyard had been built, board by board, long before that toast began. A man I had never met crouched beside me with a leather bag and a stethoscope, and someone called him doctor, and I remember thinking, through the fog, why is there a doctor already here? Not an ambulance, not the 2 paramedics that Larkspur Hill kept on retainer for every event of more than 100 guests, standard practice since my grandmother's day. A doctor. Already there, already kneeling, already, somehow, already writing something on a small pad balanced against his knee. "Pupils dilated," he murmured, to no one and everyone. "Disoriented, slurred speech. I'm concerned this is not an isolated incident." Not an isolated incident. He had never examined me before in his life, and he was already building a pattern. My father knelt on my other side, and Walter Ashworth is not a man who kneels for anyone. I had seen him remain seated when my grandmother's casket was carried past him. I had seen him remain seated the day I told him David had died. But he knelt on the flagstone of my own courtyard, in his $3,000 tuxedo, and from the inside pocket of that tuxedo, he withdrew a folded document, crisp, clean, clearly printed that afternoon or the day before, clearly never touched by rain or wind or the ordinary disorder of a life lived in real time. "Claire," he said, and his voice had none of my mother's theater in it. His voice was flat and businesslike, the voice he used to close deals, the voice I had heard him use on men 40 years his junior, right before he took something from them. "We just need a signature, just to protect the business while you rest, just temporary." He pressed a pen into my hand. My fingers would not close around it correctly. I remember the pen rolling against my palm, slick with the last of the wine that had spilled across my skin. And I remember Walter's hand steadying mine, guiding it, the way you might guide a child's hand to help her write her first letter. Somewhere behind him, through the swimming lights, I saw Emma pushing through the crowd, her green dress catching on someone's chair, her voice rising over the murmur of the guests. "Get away from her! Get away from her! What is wrong with you people?" And somewhere behind Emma, standing very still near the wine barrels stacked along the courtyard wall, I saw a woman I did not recognize, a woman in a plain gray blazer who was not drinking, was not eating, was not performing shock or grief or concern of any kind. She was simply watching my father's hand close over mine on that pen, watching my mother's tears, watching the doctor write his notes, watching, I would later understand, exactly the way she had been paid to watch. I did not know her name yet. I would learn it soon enough. And I would learn, in time, that she was not the only person in that courtyard who was there because of me, and not because of the party. The pen touched paper. I felt it touch paper, whether my name ever actually formed beneath it, whether the mark I made in that fog of drugged confusion held any shape a court would recognize as a signature, is a question I will answer for you later, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. But in that moment, on the ground, with my father's hand wrapped around mine and my mother weeping her beautiful, performed tears, and Preston already turning to a small cluster of guests to murmur that this had been coming for a long time, I believed, with the last clear thought before the dark took me, that I had already lost. I want to tell you that I fought. I want to tell you I found some reserve of strength and knocked that pen from my father's hand and stood up and told 200 people the truth. That is not what happened. What happened is that the lights went out, all of them, all at once, and the last sound I heard was my daughter screaming my name. They thought that was the end of the story. My father, kneeling in the flagstone with a signature he believed he had just stolen. My mother, already composing the version of events she would repeat to every relative and reporter for weeks. My brother, already texting someone from beneath the table where he thought no one could see his hands shaking with excitement rather than fear. They had no idea what was already sitting in a fireproof drawer 40 miles away, in the office of a woman named Miriam Sato. They had no idea that the winery they believed they had just seized had not, in any legal sense that mattered, belonged to me alone for nearly 7 years. They had no idea that the very fragility they had engineered, the very collapse they had drugged into my body in front of 200 witnesses, was the last piece of a trap that had been closing around them, slowly, silently, since long before that toast ever began. They thought they had watched me fall. What they had actually watched, though none of them would understand this for months, was the final door of their own cage swinging quietly shut. To understand how we got to that courtyard, you need to go back further than that September night. You need to go back nearly 30 years, to a woman named Eleanor Ashworth, and 3 acres of land that everyone in the valley said were worthless. My grandmother bought that land in 1979 with money she had saved from 30 years of teaching elementary school and a small settlement from a lawsuit no one in the family liked to discuss. The soil was rocky. The slope was too steep for irrigation equipment of the era. 2 different agricultural consultants told her in writing that she was wasting her savings on land that would never produce anything worth selling. Eleanor planted anyway. She planted rows of Cabernet Franc by hand, on her knees, in a straw hat that my mother used to mock at every family gathering for the rest of Eleanor's life. "Still playing farmer, Mother?" Diane would say, and Eleanor would smile the same small, patient smile every time, and say nothing at all, and go back out to the vines the next morning. I spent every summer of my childhood on that hillside. While Preston was enrolled in tennis camps and debate camps and whatever program my parents believed would produce the correct kind of son, I was sent, without much ceremony, to stay with my grandmother, because I was, in my mother's words, not really suited to that sort of thing. I did not mind. I have never minded. Some of the only truly peaceful hours of my entire childhood were spent on my knees beside Eleanor, learning the particular quiet of vine work, the way you have to listen to a plant the way you would listen to a person who cannot speak, but is nonetheless trying to tell you something urgent. They will always underestimate what they cannot be bothered to understand, my grandmother told me once, when I was maybe 14, sitting on an overturned crate at the edge of the North Block, watching the sun go down orange over rows that were, by then, finally beginning to produce fruit worth something. Let them. It leaves you room to work. I did not understand what she meant then. I understand it completely now. By the time Eleanor died, in the spring I turned 34, Larkspur Hill Vineyards had grown from 3 stubborn acres to 62, had won 2 regional gold medals, and had a small but devoted following among collectors who valued the particular mineral quality the rocky slope gave the fruit. It was not, by any measure my father cared about, a large operation. It was, by every measure that mattered to me, a miracle, built by a woman everyone else in my family had spent decades calling foolish. My father wanted to sell it within 4 months of the funeral. I remember the exact words he used, sitting at the head of the same dining table where Eleanor's memorial reception had been held only weeks before, a plate of catered sandwiches still sitting untouched on the sideboard. It's dead weight, Claire. 62 acres of dead weight that happens to look pretty in photographs. There's a group out of the city that wants the whole hillside for a resort. We could all walk away with real money instead of pretending to be farmers. I told him no. I want you to understand what it cost me to say that word to my father. Walter Ashworth built a chain of regional car dealerships from a single lot his own father left him, and he has never, in his entire life, tolerated the word no from anyone who worked for him, invested with him, or was related to him by blood. I had spent 34 years being the daughter who did not fight him. I fought him that day, in that dining room, with sandwiches going stale 6 feet away, because I understood, with a clarity I had never felt about anything else in my life, that if I did not, my grandmother's hillside would become a swimming pool for people who had never once touched the soil that made it worth anything at all. I offered to buy the 62 acres myself, along with the equipment, the small tasting room, and the modest inventory of aging wine in the cellar. I emptied nearly every account David had left me. I took a loan against the house. My father agreed to sell me his share, mostly, I believe, because he assumed I would fail within 2 years, and he would be able to buy the land back for a fraction of what the resort group had offered, once I had exhausted myself proving a point no one asked me to prove. I did not fail. I want to say that plainly, because so much of this story is about people underestimating me, and I have earned the right, after everything, to state clearly what actually happened. In 11 years, I took Larkspur Hill from 62 acres and a handful of regional medals to 140 acres, 3 national awards, a wine list carried in restaurants from Seattle to Charleston, and a business that, as of the year this story takes place, was independently appraised at just over $14 million. My family did not celebrate this. My family found it inconvenient. Every dollar Larkspur Hill earned was a dollar that made my father's early dismissal look foolish in hindsight. And Walter Ashworth has never in his life forgiven anyone for making him look foolish, least of all a daughter. Every award was a headline my mother had to explain at her country club, standing next to women whose sons had become surgeons and whose daughters had married surgeons, forced to say, with a tight, apologetic smile, that her daughter still does the wine thing. Every success was, in some private ledger none of them ever spoke aloud, a debt they believed I owed them, simply for having the audacity to prove them wrong. Success in my family was only acceptable if it happened to the correct child. Preston was the correct child. Preston had been the correct child since the day he was born, 3 years after me, golden-haired and easy-smiled in a way that made relatives coo over him at every holiday, while I stood slightly to the side, holding my mother's coat, waiting to be noticed. Preston went to the university my father wanted. Preston married Vanessa, a woman whose family owned 2 boutique hotels and who wore her wealth the way some women wear perfume, applied liberally, meant to be noticed from across a room. Preston was given, at 26, $180,000 to open a restaurant in the city, a restaurant that closed within 3 years, hemorrhaging money my father quietly absorbed and never once mentioned at Thanksgiving. I only learned the real numbers much later. Preston's restaurant had lost $210,000 before it finally folded. His second venture, a boutique investment fund that promised wealthy friends returns no legitimate fund could deliver, had quietly imploded 18 months before that September gala, leaving him, according to records I would not see until much later, roughly $340,000 in debt to men who did not send polite letters when payments were late. None of that was visible from the outside. From the outside, Preston and Vanessa lived in a house in the hills with a pool shaped like a kidney bean, and 2 leased cars replaced every 18 months. From the outside, they were the success story, and I was, in my mother's favorite phrase, the delicate one. I heard that phrase more times in my life than I can count. Diane Ashworth deployed it like a scalpel, always soft, always concerned sounding, always devastating. Claire's always been the delicate one. We worry about Claire. She's so delicate underneath all that toughness. You have to understand, she's delicate, losing David the way she did. It was never a compliment. It was a diagnosis, repeated so often that I think my mother eventually believed it herself, the way a lie told enough times begins to feel, to the liar, indistinguishable from truth. I was not delicate. I ran 140 acres of vineyard with a staff of 31 people. I had personally walked every row of that hillside during 3 separate droughts, testing soil by hand, adjusting irrigation schedules at 4 in the morning when the numbers looked wrong. I had negotiated distribution contracts with buyers who tried every single time to lowball a woman they assumed did not understand her own numbers, and every single time, I had understood my numbers better than they did. But delicate was useful to my family. Delicate explained why Claire didn't need her fair share of anything. Delicate explained why Claire could be talked over at dinner, corrected in front of guests, quietly excluded from decisions about property her own grandmother had built with her hands. And delicate, though I would not understand this until much later, was the exact word my family needed to have already established, publicly and repeatedly for years, before they could ever hope to convince a judge that I belonged in a conservatorship. You plant a story the way you plant a vine. You do not expect fruit the first season. You wait. They waited 7 years. The specific trouble, the trouble that led directly to that courtyard, that pen, that swimming string of lights, began roughly 14 months before the gala, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when my father called to invite himself and my mother to Larkspur Hill for what he described as a family conversation about the future. I should have recognized immediately that nothing good in my family has ever been introduced with the phrase, a family conversation about the future. But I did not, because I still, even then, held some small and foolish hope that my father's interest in the vineyard's future meant something closer to pride than appetite. They arrived on a Thursday in July, and Preston and Vanessa came with them, uninvited, which should have been my second warning. We sat in the tasting room, at the long, reclaimed oak table Mateo Reyes had built for me the year I took over, and my father laid out, with the same flat, businesslike voice he had used over Eleanor's abandoned sandwiches years before, a proposal from a company called Vantage Hospitality Group. Vantage wanted the hillside. Not the whole 140 acres, but the 80 most scenic acres, the ones with the best views down the valley, the ones that included both my working blocks and the small cottage where I had lived alone since David died. They wanted to build a resort, 60 rooms, a spa, an event lawn for weddings. They were offering $22 million. It's more money than this place will earn in the next 30 years combined, my father said, sliding a folder across the table toward me. You keep the remaining 60 acres if you want to keep playing at this. But Claire, be reasonable. $22 million. I said no again. I said it more calmly this time because I had said it before and survived, and because I understood, by then, precisely how much my grandmother's hillside was worth to people who had never once picked a grape from it. I told my father that Larkspur Hill was not for sale, not the 80 acres, not any acre, and that I would appreciate it if Vantage Hospitality Group did not contact me again. My mother's face did something small and sharp in that moment, a tightening around the eyes that I did not fully understand until later. Preston said almost nothing, which I also did not understand until later. And Vanessa, seated slightly apart from the rest of us with her phone in her lap, smiled the particular smile of a woman who has already decided the conversation does not matter, because the outcome has already been settled somewhere else, in a room I was not invited into. I did not know it then, but that Thursday in July was the moment the clock actually started. Not the gala, not the toast. That afternoon, in my own tasting room, at a table built for me by a man who had known my grandmother, my family decided, quietly and without my knowledge, that if I would not sign the hillside away willingly, they would find another way to make my signature stop mattering at all. The first strange thing I noticed came about 6 weeks later, in late August, when my cousin Renata called me on a Sunday evening, her voice low in a way that immediately put me on alert. Renata worked as a loan officer at a regional bank, not the bank Larkspur Hill used for its own accounts, but close enough within the small world of Valley finance that people talked. And Renata had, over the years, become something of an informal early warning system for anything strange moving through the family's financial orbit. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this," she said, and I could hear her stepping outside, a door closing, wind picking up on her end of the line. "But your father came in last week asking about something called an emergency conservatorship loan. It's not really a product we offer. It's more of a bridge arrangement some families use when they're managing an incapacitated relative's assets and need liquidity fast." He asked pretty specific questions, Claire. He asked what kind of documentation the bank would need to recognize a court-appointed conservator's authority over an LLC's business accounts. I remember standing very still in my kitchen, the phone pressed hard against my ear, the evening light going gold and strange through the window over the sink. "Conservator over whose accounts?" I said, though some cold, quiet part of me already suspected the answer. "He didn't say a name," Renata said. "But, Claire, he asked about wineries specifically. He asked if a family LLC that held vineyard property would be treated the same way as a personal account under a conservatorship order." I did not sleep that night. I told myself, for a while, that I was overreacting. My father had always been aggressive about money, always looking 3 moves ahead, always testing doors to see which ones might open. Perhaps this was nothing more than one of his habitual, half-formed schemes, the kind he floated and abandoned constantly, the kind that never actually became real. But I could not stop thinking about my mother's face at that tasting room table in July, the tightening around her eyes, the way Preston had gone quiet in a room where he was usually the loudest voice, the way Vanessa had smiled at her phone, already certain of an outcome I had believed, in that moment, that I controlled. I called Emma that week, my daughter, 22 years old and finishing her degree in viticulture at the State University 2 hours south. And I did not tell her everything, because she was in the middle of exams, and I did not want to frighten her over what might still turn out to be nothing. But I asked her, carefully, whether her grandparents or her uncle had reached out to her lately, whether they had asked her anything unusual. "Grandma called last week," Emma said, and I could hear the wariness in her own voice, the particular caution my daughter has always carried around my mother, even as a child. She asked a lot of questions about how you've been doing, whether you seemed stressed, whether I thought you were, and I'm quoting her exactly, Mom, whether I thought you were handling everything okay since Dad died. 6 years later, out of nowhere. 3 separate threads, 3 separate weeks, 3 separate people in my family suddenly, urgently curious about my emotional stability, my financial competence, my capacity to be trusted with the thing I had spent 11 years building with my own hands. I want to be honest about the moment I understood, fully, what was happening, because I think it is important for you to know that it did not arrive as a single dramatic revelation. It arrived slowly, the way frost arrives on a vineyard in October, one cold morning at a time, until you look up and realize the whole hillside has changed overnight, even though no single night felt different from the one before it. It was Mateo who finally said the word out loud. Mateo Reyes had worked the Larkspur Hill vine since he was 19 years old, hired by my grandmother the same summer she planted her first 3 acres, and he had stayed through every hard season since, through drought and frost, and the year the fires came close enough that we could taste smoke in the fruit. He was 61 that September, broad-shouldered and quiet, a man who said very little but noticed everything. And when I found him in the equipment barn one evening in early September, checking the tractor's oil by the light of a single bare bulb, I told him what Renata had said, what Emma had said, the pattern that would not stop assembling itself in my mind, no matter how hard I tried to look away from it. Mateo set down his rag very slowly and looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. "Guardianship," he said. "That's the word for it, Claire. They're building a case that you can't run this place, and once a judge signs an order like that, it doesn't matter whose name is on the deed. Someone else gets to make every decision. Someone else gets to sign every check." I remember the cold that went through me at that word, spoken plainly for the first time, out loud, in my own equipment barn, by a man who had known me since I was a child following my grandmother between the rows. Guardianship, conservatorship, whatever legal name it wore, the shape of it was the same, and the shape of it was this. If my family could convince a court that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, they would not need my signature on anything ever again. They would simply need a judge's signature, and a judge who had never met me, and a doctor willing to say the right words in the right order. I asked Mateo, quietly, whether he thought they could actually pull it off. He was silent for a long moment, wiping his hands on the rag, not meeting my eyes. "Depends how far they're willing to go," he finally said. "And Claire, I've watched your family a long time. I don't think there's a floor to how far they're willing to go." He was right. I would learn exactly how right he was on the night of September 20th, when the string lights swam and the floor tilted, and my father's hand closed over mine on a pen I never chose to hold. But before that night, I had roughly 3 weeks to decide what kind of woman I was going to be. The delicate one my mother had spent 7 years describing to anyone who would listen? Or someone else entirely, someone my grandmother had spent every summer of my childhood quietly, patiently, teaching me how to become, without either of us ever using the word out loud. I chose. And what I chose, and how I built it in near total silence over those 3 weeks, is the reason that courtyard did not end the way my family believed it would end. But to understand why their trap failed, you first need to understand something my family did not know, something none of them had bothered to learn in the 7 years since Eleanor's death, because learning it would have required them to take me seriously even a little, even once. You need to understand what I had already done 4 years before any of this began, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in the office of a woman named Miriam Sato. I had gone to Miriam not because I suspected my family of anything, not back then, but because Eleanor's death had taught me something about the fragility of ownership when it lives in only one name, one signature, one mortal body. I had watched how quickly my father tried to seize control of Eleanor's land the moment she was in the ground, how a woman's entire life's work could become, within weeks, a line item in someone else's spreadsheet. I did not want that to happen to what I had built. I did not want it to happen to Emma's inheritance. And so, on that rainy Tuesday, I sat across from Miriam Sato's desk and asked her a simple question. If something happened to me, I said, if I became sick or incapacitated, or if anyone ever tried to take this place out of my hands while I was still alive but unable to fight for it, is there a way to make sure it survives me? All of it? Not just after I die, while I'm still here and maybe not able to speak for myself. Miriam Sato looked at me for a long moment, the rain streaking the window behind her, and then she said something I have carried with me every day since. There is, she said, but it means giving up a kind of control most people are too proud to give up. It means the vineyard stops being something you own and becomes something you protect. Are you ready to do that? I said yes before she had even finished the sentence. What we built together over the following months was not something dramatic. It did not feel, at the time, like preparing for war. It felt like paperwork, tedious and dry, filed away in a drawer I rarely thought about, in an office 40 miles from the hillside where I spent my actual days. But paperwork, when it is built correctly, by the right hands at the right time, becomes something far more powerful than any single signature ever could be. I want to walk you through exactly what that paperwork was, because I think the specifics matter, and because I have come to believe that vague gestures at protecting yourself are worth almost nothing compared to understanding, in plain and concrete terms, what protection actually looks like on paper. Miriam did not simply draft a will and call it a day. A will, she reminded me more than once during those early meetings, is a document that only wakes up the moment you die. It has no power at all while you are alive but vulnerable. And vulnerable, as I would learn in that courtyard 5 weeks later, does not require a body to have stopped breathing. It only requires a body that cannot speak for itself. What Miriam built instead was a structure with 3 separate moving parts, and she made me repeat each one back to her, slowly, in my own words, until she was satisfied I actually understood what I was signing, rather than simply trusting her competence and closing my eyes to the details. The first part was the trust itself. We named it the Eleanor Ashworth Trust, after my grandmother, partly out of sentiment, I will admit, and partly because Miriam said a trust named for a beloved founder tends to survive family challenges better than one named simply for tax convenience. The trust was drafted as irrevocable, which meant, Miriam explained, sliding a diagram across her desk with small labeled boxes connected by careful lines, that once it was signed, sealed, and funded, not even I could undo it on a whim, or under pressure, or because someone I loved asked me to. That is the entire point, she told me, tapping the diagram with one finger. An irrevocable trust that you can dissolve whenever someone leans on you hard enough is not protection, Claire. It is theater. The whole value of this structure is that it holds even against you. Even against me. I remember sitting with that phrase for a long moment, understanding for the first time that real protection sometimes means building a wall you yourself cannot climb over either, not just one meant to keep other people out. The second part was the transfer of Larkspur Hill's actual legal ownership into that trust. This was the piece that took the longest, and the piece that felt, at the time, the most abstract and unglamorous. We were not simply drawing up paper promises. We were retitling 62 acres of land at the time, before I expanded the operation further, along with the LLC that held the winery's brand, its equipment, its contracts, and its accounts. Every deed had to be redrawn. Every account had to be re-registered under the trust's name rather than my own. Miriam filed the new deed with the county recorder's office herself on a Thursday afternoon in March, and I remember she called me the moment it was stamped and logged into the public record, her voice carrying an odd note of quiet ceremony for something that, on paper, looked like nothing more than a bureaucratic formality. "It's done," she said. "As of 2:14 this afternoon, Larkspur Hill Vineyards belongs to the Eleanor Ashworth Trust. Not to you. You are the trust's managing director, which means you run every acre of it exactly as you always have. But you are not, any longer, its owner." I laughed, a little nervously, and asked her whether that meant I had just given away everything I had worked for. "No," she said. "It means no one can ever take it from you again by taking you. That is a very different thing." The third part, the piece I would come to understand as the most quietly devastating detail in the entire structure, was the question of who controlled the trust if I could not. Miriam had insisted from our very first conversation that the trust needed at least one co-trustee, someone with full legal authority equal to my own, precisely so that no single point of failure, no single body that could be drugged or hospitalized or declared incompetent could ever leave the trust vulnerable to exactly the kind of pressure my family would eventually attempt. We considered several names. I remember sitting in Miriam's office with a legal pad, listing relatives, old friends, a former college roommate who had gone on to become a judge in another state, weighing each one against a single hard question Miriam kept asking. Who, among everyone you know, could not be bought, frightened, or flattered into working against you? Emma's name came up almost immediately, and I dismissed it at first because she was only 18 at the time, barely out of high school, and it felt, I told Miriam, like handing a teenager a burden she had not asked for and could not fully understand yet. Miriam did not argue with me directly. She simply asked a second question. "Do you trust her judgment more than you trust anyone else's?" I did. I had watched Emma, even as a teenager, refuse to bend to her grandmother's particular brand of pressure in ways I myself had struggled with my entire adult life. She had an instinct for fairness that neither Preston nor I had been raised with, an instinct I sometimes wondered whether she had inherited directly from Eleanor, skipping straight over the generation in between. We settled on a compromise that Miriam drafted with unusual care. Emma would be named successor co-trustee, with full authority to take her seat the moment she turned 25, old enough, Miriam reasoned, to have finished her education and begun to understand the weight of what she was inheriting. Until that date arrived, Miriam herself would serve as sole co-trustee alongside me, a neutral, professionally bound fiduciary with no blood relationship to my family whatsoever, and therefore, crucially, no vulnerability to the particular currents of guilt, favoritism, and manufactured obligation that ran so deep through the Ashworth family that I sometimes wondered whether they were simply part of our shared bloodline. "A fiduciary duty is not sentiment," Miriam told me once, near the end of that long process. "It is law. I am bound to act in the trust's best interest regardless of who calls my office, regardless of what they threaten, regardless of how convincingly they cry. Your mother could sit across this desk from me and weep for 3 hours, Claire, and it would not move one clause of this document, because my obligation runs to the trust, not to her performance." I did not know, sitting in that office on that rainy Tuesday, precisely how prophetic her words would turn out to be. I did not know that my mother would, in fact, one day sit across a desk somewhere and weep beautifully over documents she desperately wanted altered. I only knew, closing that meeting, signing page after page in Miriam's careful, patient presence, that I finally understood what my grandmother had meant all those summers ago about leaving myself room to work. The paperwork sat quietly after that, exactly as I told you, filed in a drawer, renewed annually with a brief, almost perfunctory review meeting that took less than an hour each spring. I went back to my ordinary life. I walked the rows. I adjusted irrigation schedules during the drought years. I signed distribution contracts and argued gently with buyers who tried to lowball a woman they assumed did not understand her own numbers. I forgot, most days, that the wall even existed. The way you forget the foundation of a house you have lived in for years, trusting it simply because it has never once given you reason not to. I had no idea in those quiet years exactly how soon I would need to remember every single clause of it. It becomes a wall that no one can see, standing exactly where your enemies expect an open door. And on the night of September 20th, when my father pressed a pen into my drugged, unsteady hand and believed, with every fiber of his ambitious heart, that he had just taken everything from me, he had no idea that the wall was already standing. He had no idea that the document trembling beneath my fingers on that flagstone was, in the end, nothing more than paper. Worthless paper. Because the thing they had spent 7 years plotting to steal had not, for 4 years already, been mine to give away. I woke up the morning after the gala in a hospital bed, with a headache that felt like a fist behind my eyes, an IV line taped to the back of my hand, and Emma asleep in a chair pulled close to the rail, still wearing her green dress from the night before, her makeup smeared with dried tears she had not bothered to wipe away. She woke the moment I stirred, the way mothers wake at the smallest shift in an infant's breathing, the way I imagine daughters learn to wake around mothers they are afraid of losing. "Mom," she whispered, and her hand found mine before my eyes had even fully adjusted to the fluorescent light overhead. "Mom, you're okay. You're okay." I was not entirely okay, not yet, but I was alive, and I was, blessedly, thinking clearly again, the fog of whatever they had put in my wine finally beginning to lift. I asked Emma, my voice cracked and unfamiliar, what had happened after I went dark in the courtyard. What she told me, in a low, furious whisper, hunched close to the bed rail so the nurse in the hallway would not overhear, confirmed every fear that had been assembling itself in my mind for 3 weeks. "They had me sign something too," Emma said, "while you were unconscious. Grandpa tried to get me to sign a statement saying I'd noticed you having, quote, episodes of confusion and paranoia over the last year. I told him to go to hell, Mom. I told him if he came near me with another piece of paper, I'd call the police myself." My daughter was 22 years old, and she had stood alone in a hospital hallway against her own grandfather, refusing to sign away her mother's life while I lay unconscious 8 feet away. That is the moment, if you are looking for the moment, when I understood exactly how much was at stake, and exactly who was worth protecting, and exactly how far I was willing to go to make certain no one in my family ever tried something like this again. But I am getting ahead of myself. Because the toxicology report that came back from that hospital 3 days later would become the single most important piece of paper in this entire story. And I want you to understand exactly how it came to exist and exactly what it proved before I tell you what I did with it. The emergency room physician who treated me that night, a woman named Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, who had never met my family and owed them nothing, had ordered a full toxicology panel as a matter of routine, standard protocol for any patient who collapsed with slurred speech and dilated pupils at a public event. It was not something my family requested. It was not something my family could have prevented, short of somehow reaching Dr. Okonkwo before the blood draw, which they had not thought to do, because they had not imagined even for a moment that anyone would think to test me at all. The results showed a significant concentration of a benzodiazepine sedative in my bloodstream, at a level consistent, Dr. Okonkwo told me plainly, with what she called a deliberately administered dose, not a prescribed one. I had no prescription for any such medication. I had never taken it in my life. Someone had put it in my glass. I remember sitting up in that hospital bed, the paper gown scratchy against my skin, staring at that report in Emma's hands, and feeling something shift inside my chest. Not the wounded, frightened woman who had believed, on the flagstone of her own courtyard, that she had already lost everything. Someone else. Someone colder and steadier and very, very patient. My grandmother's voice came back to me then, from a summer evening 30 years gone, sitting on an overturned crate at the edge of the North Block. They will always underestimate what they cannot be bothered to understand. Let them. It leaves you room to work. I had room to work, and I intended to use every inch of it. The first call I made from that hospital room was not to my father, demanding an explanation. It was not to my mother, asking why she had wept so beautifully over a daughter she had helped drug. It was to Miriam Sato, and when she picked up on the second ring, her voice sharp with the particular alertness of a woman who reads the news, and who had clearly already seen some version of what happened at Larkspur Hill circulating on local social media, I said only 6 words. They tried it, just like we planned. There was a pause on the line, brief but weighted, and then Miriam said, in a voice as calm and level as still water, "Then it's time to open the drawer." What was in that drawer, and what it would ultimately do to my father, my mother, my brother, and every person who had helped them believe they could drug a woman in front of 200 witnesses and walk away owning her life's work, is the rest of this story. But they did not know that yet. On the morning after the gala, while I lay in that hospital bed with my daughter's hand in mine, and a toxicology report proving exactly what had been done to me, my family believed they were still winning. Preston had already called 3 local news outlets, describing, in careful, sympathetic language, his sister's ongoing struggles and the family's difficult decision to seek protective oversight of her affairs. My mother had already begun composing the story she would tell at church, at the club, to every relative who called to ask what on earth had happened at that gala. My father had already sat down with Gordon Beck, the family's longtime attorney, a sharp, silver-haired man who had helped Walter Ashworth close every questionable deal of his career, to begin drafting the emergency conservatorship petition they intended to file within the week. They believed the hardest part was already behind them. They believed the woman on the flagstone, the woman whose hand they had guided across a page she could not read, was already theirs. They had no idea that the toxicology report sitting in my hospital chart was about to become the single most expensive mistake of their lives. They had no idea that 4 years earlier, in a rainy office 40 miles away, I had already given away the one thing they were trying so desperately to take. And they had absolutely no idea, none of them, not my father with his rehearsed flat voice, not my mother with her performed and beautiful tears, not my brother with his $340,000 of hidden debt, not even Dr. Halloway with his premature diagnosis and his conveniently early arrival, that the woman they believed they had just broken was, in that hospital bed, already beginning to build the thing that would break them instead. I discharged myself 2 days later, against the mild protests of a nurse who did not know what waited for me outside those hospital doors, and Emma drove me home along the familiar curve of the valley road, past vineyards turning gold at the edges as the season began its slow tilt toward harvest, and neither of us spoke for most of the drive, because there was, for the moment, nothing left to say that would not have broken something in both of us. But when we crested the final hill, and the old farmhouse and the barn and the long rows of Larkspur Hill came into view below us, gilded in the low afternoon light, I felt something settle in my chest that had not been there since the courtyard. Resolve. Not the frightened, uncertain resolve of a woman trying to survive her family's cruelty. Something quieter and colder and far more dangerous to the people who had built this trap around me. The resolve of a woman who finally understood, completely and without any remaining doubt, exactly what her family was capable of, and exactly what she was going to do about it. I asked Emma to pull the car over at the top of the drive before we reached the house, and I sat for a long moment looking down at the hillside my grandmother had planted with her own hands, at the vines that had survived drought and fire and 7 years of my family's quiet, patient contempt. "They think this is over," I told Emma. "They think I'm broken. They think the next thing that happens is a judge signing a piece of paper that hands them everything." Emma looked at me, her eyes still red-rimmed from 3 sleepless nights, and asked the only question that mattered. "Is it over?" I smiled, for the first time since the string lights had started to swim, and it was not a smile my mother would have recognized as belonging to her delicate daughter. "No," I said, "it's about to begin." What neither Emma nor I fully understood yet, in that quiet moment at the top of the drive, was exactly how much preparation the coming weeks would require, or exactly how many people, old allies and new ones, I would need to bring quietly into my confidence before the trap I had built 4 years earlier could finally close around the people who had built theirs around me. But I knew where to start. I knew who to call first, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever my father, my mother, and my brother believed they had accomplished on that courtyard flagstone, the real story of Larkspur Hill Vineyards was only just getting started. The following morning, I drove myself to Miriam Sato's office instead of calling ahead, because some conversations deserve to happen across a desk rather than down a phone line, and because I needed, more than anything, to see the paperwork with my own eyes again, 4 years after I had signed it and mostly tried not to think about it. Miriam's office occupied the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian on the edge of the county seat, a building that had once been a private home and still smelled faintly of old wood polish and the particular dry paper scent of decades of legal filings. She met me at the door herself, which she did not typically do for clients, and the look on her face told me she had already read enough news coverage overnight to understand exactly how serious this had become. "Tell me everything," she said, closing her office door behind us. "From the beginning. Don't leave anything out, even the parts that feel too small to matter." I told her. I told her about the July meeting in my tasting room, about Vantage Hospitality Group's $22 million offer, about Renata's call regarding the conservatorship loan inquiry, about Emma's strange conversation with my mother, about Matteo naming the word guardianship out loud in the equipment barn. I told her about the string lights swimming, about my father's hand closing over mine on that pen, about Dr. Halloway's suspiciously early arrival and his suspiciously premature diagnosis. I told her about the toxicology report. The concentration Dr. Okonkwo had described as consistent with deliberate administration. Miriam listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small, precise hand, her expression giving away nothing until I finished. "All right," she said finally, setting down her pen. "Let's start with what they actually got that night and what they didn't." She pulled a thick folder from a locked cabinet behind her desk, a folder I recognized immediately, its edges softened with 4 years of storage, but its contents, I would soon confirm, entirely intact. "In the spring of your 4th year after Eleanor's death," Miriam said, "you came to me and asked how to protect Larkspur Hill from exactly this kind of scenario. Do you remember what we did?" I remembered the broad strokes. I had not, until that morning, remembered every specific mechanism, because at the time, it had felt like distant, almost paranoid precaution, the kind of thing you do out of caution rather than expectation. "We didn't just write a will," Miriam continued. "A will only matters after you die, and your father clearly wasn't planning to wait for that. What we did instead was restructure ownership of the vineyard entirely. Larkspur Hill Vineyards, the LLC, the land, the equipment, the brand, all of it, is not owned by you personally anymore, Claire. It hasn't been for 4 years. It's owned by the Eleanor Ashworth Trust." I nodded slowly. I remembered this part. "The trust is irrevocable," Miriam went on. "That means, by design, that even you cannot unwind it on your own, which was the entire point. You retain what's called a beneficial interest, meaning the income from the vineyard's operations flows to you, and you retain full authority as the trust's managing director to run day-to-day operations exactly as you always have. But legal ownership, the actual title to the land and the membership interest in the LLC, belongs to the trust itself, not to you as an individual." "And a conservatorship order," I said slowly, understanding beginning to bloom cold and clear in my chest, "would only give someone authority over my personal assets." "Exactly," Miriam said. "A conservator appointed over Claire Ashworth as a person could, theoretically, control your personal bank accounts, your medical decisions, your day-to-day affairs. But a conservator over an individual has no legal authority whatsoever over assets that individual does not personally own. And Larkspur Hill, every acre, every vine, every dollar of goodwill in that brand has not been personally owned by you since the spring you sat in this office 4 years ago and asked me how to protect it." I sat very still for a long moment, absorbing the full shape of what she was telling me. "So the signature," I said, "the one my father put a pen in my hand for. Whatever I signed or half-signed or whatever mark ended up on that page, means nothing," Miriam said simply, "because you had nothing left to sign away. Even if that document was a perfectly executed transfer of the vineyard, notarized and witnessed and filed the same night, it would be legally void, because you were never the vineyard's sole owner to begin with. You cannot give away what you no longer personally hold." I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in 3 weeks, a knot I had not fully realized I was carrying until it began, slowly, to release. "There's more," Miriam said, and something in her tone made me sit forward. "When we restructured the ownership, you named co-trustees. Do you remember who?" I remembered, though the memory had faded into something abstract over 4 years of ordinary life. "Emma," I said, "and you." "Emma, once she turns 25, Miriam confirmed. "Until then, I serve as sole co-trustee alongside you, specifically so that no single family member, including you, could ever be pressured or manipulated into unilaterally dissolving the trust or transferring its assets. Which means, Claire, that even in the outside chance a court had granted your family some form of authority over your personal affairs that night, it would not have mattered. I am still here. I am still the trust's co-trustee, and I would never, under any circumstances, have honored a transfer request that originated from your father, your mother, or your brother. I put my face in my hands for a moment. Not crying, exactly, but something close to it. The release of 3 weeks of quiet, gnawing terror finally finding an exit. They don't know any of this, I said, looking up. None of it. Not the trust. Not you. Not Emma's role. They think the vineyard is still mine, personally, and that all they needed was a judge's signature to take it. They do think that, Miriam said. And for the first time that morning, something sharp and almost pleased flickered across her composed features. Which means, Claire, that everything they have done, drugging you in front of 200 people, forging what I suspect will turn out to be a backdated guardianship petition, pressuring your own daughter to sign a false statement, all of it has been in service of stealing something that was never theirs to take. They built an elaborate, criminal scheme to seize a business that legally stopped being seizable 4 years before they ever started planning it. I sat with that for a long moment, the full weight and strange, cold satisfaction of it settling over me. So what happens now? I asked. Do we just tell them? Do we show them the trust documents and let them realize how badly they've failed? Miriam Sato looked at me for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had the same quiet, patient quality Eleanor's had, all those summer evenings on the crate at the edge of the North Block. No, she said. Not yet. Right now, all we have is a failed attempt. If we simply show them the trust and send them away humiliated, they slink off, they lick their wounds, and in a year, they try something else. Smarter this time, because now they know what mistake to avoid. What we want, Claire, is not just to survive what they did. We want to make certain they can never do it to you, or to Emma, or to anyone else, ever again. And for that, we need more than the trust documents. We need everything. The petition, the doctor, the bank inquiries, the debts. We need to build a case so complete that when it finally comes down, there is nothing left standing. I looked out the window of Miriam's office at the rain beginning to streak the glass. The same rain, I realized, that had been falling the day I first sat in that office 4 years ago. And I felt the last of the frightened, delicate woman my mother had spent 7 years describing finally step aside, leaving only the woman my grandmother had spent every summer of my childhood quietly preparing me to become. Tell me what you need, I said. I'll build it. Over the following 10 days, in near total silence, I began assembling exactly that. The first person I brought fully into my confidence, after Miriam and Emma, was Matteo, because I trusted him with my life, and because he had already named the danger before anyone else in my orbit had the courage to. I met him in the equipment barn again, the same bare bulb burning overhead, and I told him everything Miriam had explained. The trust, the co-trusteeship, the legal wall that had been standing invisible around Larkspur Hill for 4 years. Matteo listened, nodding slowly, and when I finished, He said only, "Your grandmother would be proud of you. Not for the wine. For this." He agreed, without hesitation, to help me quietly document anything unusual he observed among the staff or around the property in the coming weeks. And more importantly, he agreed to keep his eyes and ears open among the small, tightly knit community of vendors, contractors, and seasonal workers who moved through Larkspur Hill, and often knew things long before they reached my desk. It was Mateo who told me, 4 days later, about the locksmith. "Rick Alvarez," Mateo said, naming a locksmith who had done small jobs around the valley for years. "He called me last week, asked if I still worked here, said your father had hired him back in July to rekey the tasting room office and duplicate a set of keys. Said it seemed strange to him because your father doesn't own that building anymore, hasn't for years. But Rick didn't think much of it until he heard about the gala on the news." July. The same month as that tasting room meeting, the $22 million offer, my flat refusal. My father had, apparently, ordered a locksmith to duplicate keys to my own office within days of my telling him Larkspur Hill was not for sale. I asked Rick Alvarez, gently and carefully, whether he would be willing to speak with an investigator about the job, and whether he still had any paperwork from it. He did. Locksmiths, it turns out, keep meticulous records, precisely because their work sits at the intersection of trust and liability. And Rick had an invoice, dated July 23rd, itemizing the rekeying of a tasting room office door and the production of 2 duplicate keys, billed to Walter Ashworth personally. That invoice became the first physical document in what would grow, over the following weeks, into a folder considerably thicker than the one Miriam had shown me on our first meeting. The second person I brought in was a private investigator named Renata Cole. No relation to my cousin Renata, despite the coincidence of names. A sharp, unassuming woman in her 50s, who Miriam had worked with on prior matters and trusted completely. I met Renata Cole for the first time in a coffee shop 2 towns over from the valley, deliberately outside the small, gossiping orbit of Larkspur Hills community, and I told her everything. "I want to know who Dr. Holloway is," I told her. "I want to know his relationship with my father, whether he's done anything like this before, and I want to know if there's any record of him examining me prior to that night, because there wasn't one, not that I ever consented to." Renata Cole took careful notes, asked precise, uncomfortable questions I had not thought to ask myself, and within a week, she came back with information that made the cold, quiet fury in my chest burn considerably hotter. Dr. Richard Holloway had been my father's personal physician for 11 years, and, more relevantly, his golfing partner and occasional business associate. 3 years earlier, Holloway had been quietly investigated by the state medical board for improperly certifying a wealthy patient's incapacity in a contested inheritance dispute, a case that had been settled out of court before any formal discipline was issued, but which had left, buried in public court filings, a clear record of the allegation. He had, in other words, done this before. "There's more," Renata Cole told me, sliding a printed page across the table of that quiet coffee shop, her voice low. "I found a text message, obtained through channels I won't detail for you, sent from Dr. Holloway's phone to your brother Preston, dated September 4th, 16 days before the gala." I read it twice before the words fully settled. "I can be there Saturday evening. Just make sure she has enough wine in her that the confusion looks natural when I arrive." Once I document it on site, the petition basically writes itself. I sat with that message for a long time, the coffee shop noise fading around me into a distant hum, feeling something in my chest go entirely, terrifyingly cold. They had planned it. Not in some vague, opportunistic way, but in specific, written, dated detail. 16 days in advance, discussing my sedation in the same breath as a party invitation, as casually as if they were arranging catering. Renata Cole watched my face carefully. "I know this is hard to sit with," she said. "But Claire, this is exactly the kind of evidence that ends careers and puts people in courtrooms. This is not circumstantial. This is a written confession of intent." I asked her, my voice steadier than I expected, what else she had found. The list, over the following 2 weeks, grew longer than I had imagined possible. A draft guardianship petition, prepared by Gordon Beck's office and dated August 22nd, nearly a month before the gala, describing incidents of my supposed confusion and instability that had never actually occurred. Incidents Gordon Beck's own paralegal would later admit, under careful questioning, had been dictated to her by Preston and Diane, rather than observed by anyone firsthand. Bank records showing Preston had, in fact, accumulated $341,000 in personal debt across 2 failed ventures and an undisclosed gambling habit Vanessa herself did not fully know about. Correspondence between Gordon Beck's office and an attorney representing Vantage Hospitality Group, confirming that the resort group's $22 million offer remained open, contingent on, in the attorney's own written words, resolution of the current ownership complications on the Ashworth side. Resolution of the current ownership complications. That was what they called me. I want to pause here, in the telling of this, and say something honestly, because I think it matters more than the anger, more than the cold satisfaction of watching a case build itself brick by brick against the people who raised me. What I felt, reading that phrase, resolution of the current ownership complications, was not primarily fury. It was grief. I had spent my entire life hoping, in some small, stubborn corner of my heart, that my family's coldness toward me was a failure of expression rather than a failure of feeling. I told myself, for years, that my mother loved me in her own limited way, that my father's dismissiveness was simply the blunt instrument of a man who did not know how to show pride except through criticism, that Preston's golden favor was simply an accident of birth order rather than a reflection of my own worth. I told myself these things because the alternative, that they simply did not love me, that I was, to them, an ownership complication requiring resolution, was too painful to sit with directly. That folder made it impossible to look away from any longer. But grief, I learned in those weeks, does not have to be the last word. Grief can sit beside resolve, quietly, without canceling it out. I could mourn the family I had wished for, and still, in the very same breath, build the case that would end the one I actually had. The third person I brought into my confidence, after Miriam, Matteo, and Renata Cole, was Emma. Though, in truth, Emma had already brought herself in, standing in that hospital hallway, refusing to sign her grandfather's false statement before I had even asked her to. I sat with her one evening in the kitchen of the farmhouse, the same kitchen where Eleanor used to make dinner for the two of us on those long summer visits, and I laid out everything: the trust, the co-trusteeship, the text message, the draft petition, the debts. Emma listened in silence, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold, and when I finished, she asked the question I had been waiting for and dreading since the moment I began. What do you want to do to them? I considered my answer carefully, because I understood, even then, that whatever I told my daughter in that kitchen would shape not only what happened to her grandparents and her uncle, but what kind of woman she would grow into believing power was for. I don't want revenge, I told her, and I meant it, though I understood how strange that might sound given everything I had already begun building. Revenge would mean hurting them the way they hurt me, just to watch them hurt. What I want is consequence. I want them to face, publicly and completely, exactly what they tried to do, with no room left for them to spin it into some story about a fragile daughter who fell apart at her own party. I want the truth on the table, in front of the same people who watched me fall, so no one is ever confused again about who did what to whom. Emma nodded slowly. And the winery, she said. What happens to Larkspur Hill? Larkspur Hill was never really at risk, I said. Not legally. But I want them to understand that. I want them to stand in front of everyone and learn, in real time, that everything they did, the drugging, the doctor, the petition, all of it was for nothing. That they hurt me and used you and paid a doctor to lie, and it accomplished exactly nothing except destroying themselves. My daughter reached across the table and took my hand, the same way she had in that hospital bed, and said something that I have carried with me every day since. Grandma Eleanor would have loved watching you do this. I believed her. I still do. The fourth and final piece of the preparation, the piece that would ultimately transform this from a private legal maneuver into a public reckoning, came from an unexpected direction, roughly 2 weeks into my quiet campaign, when Miriam Sato called me with news that changed the shape of everything. I need you to sit down, she said, and I could hear something unusual in her voice, an edge of genuine surprise from a woman who rarely displayed surprise about anything. There's a county unit, Miriam explained, that handles fiduciary abuse and elder exploitation cases, though it applies more broadly than just elder victims. Anything involving conservatorship fraud or coerced financial control falls under their jurisdiction. I had already flagged your case with them informally, given the severity of what we'd uncovered, mostly to protect the paper trail and make sure everything we gathered would hold up if this ever went to court. This morning, an investigator named Frank Doyle called me back. He's been quietly building a file on Dr. Holloway for months, completely independent of your case. What kind of file? I asked. It turns out, Miriam said, your father's doctor friend has done this before, and not just the case 3 years ago that got quietly settled. Doyle's team believes Holloway has certified false incapacity findings in at least 2 other disputed inheritance and conservatorship cases over the past 6 years. Always for a fee, always for families with something significant to gain. He's been careful and he's been lucky, and every time the families involved settled quietly rather than pursuing charges, because families like mine would rather bury an embarrassment than expose it publicly. I sat with that for a long moment, the shape of the trap I had been quietly building suddenly widening far beyond anything I had originally imagined. Doyle wants to be present, Miriam continued, at whatever setting this ultimately comes to a head. Quietly, not as a dramatic arrest scene, nothing like that, but as an official witness who can, if necessary, formally document any admission or confirmation that occurs. If your family says the wrong thing in front of him, Claire, in front of witnesses, it stops being a private family dispute we can resolve with paperwork and trust documents. It becomes a criminal matter with an actual prosecutable case. I thought of my father, kneeling on the flagstone with his flat, business-like voice, of my mother's beautiful, performed tears, of Preston's rehearsed sentence about how I hadn't been well for months. I thought of Dr. Holloway's text message, 16 days in advance, discussing my sedation as casually as catering. Tell him yes, I said. Tell him I'll make sure there's a setting. And that is precisely what I began, over the following 10 days, to build. I decided, after long consultation with Miriam and considerable thought of my own, that the confrontation needed to happen publicly, and it needed to happen at an event my family could not avoid attending without raising suspicion, because privacy had only ever protected them. Every cruelty I had endured over the years had happened deliberately in private, or had been reframed in public into something more flattering to them. I wanted, for the first time, for the truth to happen in exactly the kind of setting they had always used to control the narrative, but with the narrative finally, completely in my own hands. Larkspur Hill hosted an annual harvest celebration each October, smaller and more intimate than the September anniversary gala, but still attended by nearly 150 guests, distributors, local press, longtime customers, and, every year without fail, my family, who enjoyed the prestige of being seen at an event that had, however reluctantly on their part, become locally significant. I let it be known, quietly, through channels I knew would reach my mother within days, that I intended to make an announcement at the harvest celebration regarding the future of Larkspur Hill, given, as I phrased it deliberately, everything the family has been through this fall. I wanted them to believe I was finally capitulating. I wanted my father to believe that the conservatorship petition, quietly filed with the county court 2 weeks after the gala and currently awaiting a hearing date, combined with the humiliation of the toxicology report becoming, in his mind, something he could still spin as a symptom of my instability rather than evidence of his crime, had finally worn me down enough to accept whatever arrangement he proposed. I wanted my mother to believe her beautiful, performed grief had finally accomplished its purpose. I wanted Preston to believe his rehearsed sentence about my declining health was about to be vindicated in front of the very community that had watched me collapse. I let all of that reach them, carefully, through Renata, my cousin, through mutual acquaintances, through the particular grapevine that moves faster and more thoroughly through small wine country communities than any newspaper ever could. And 3 weeks before the harvest celebration, my father called me directly for the first time since the gala, his voice carrying the same flat, satisfied confidence I remembered from that tasting room table over Eleanor's untouched sandwiches. "I hear you're ready to talk sense," he said. No greeting, no inquiry into my health, nothing but the particular tone of a man who believes he has already won and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up to reality. "I think it's time we settled this," I told him, "and I want you to understand that every word I said to my father in that call was true, in the way that a trap is true to the animal it is built for. I did think it was time we settled this. I simply had an entirely different understanding of what settlement meant than he did." "Good," Walter said. "Gordon's drawn up an arrangement. Nothing dramatic. You keep a role, an advisory position, something with your name still attached for the marketing. People like that kind of story. But operational control, the accounts, the contracts, the decisions, that transfers to a family trust your mother and I will oversee, along with Preston. It's the responsible thing, Claire, given everything." Given everything. As if the everything he referred to was my fragility, and not his own hand guiding mine across a page beside a doctor he had paid to lie. "Send me the paperwork," I said. "I'll have my attorney review it before the harvest celebration." My father agreed, entirely satisfied, and I hung up the phone and sat for a long moment in the quiet of my kitchen, feeling the last piece of the trap settle into place. They believed they were closing in on their prize. What they did not understand, what none of them would understand until the afternoon of the harvest celebration itself, was that every document Gordon Beck had prepared, every arrangement my father believed he was about to formalize, targeted an ownership structure that had not existed, legally, for 4 years. They were negotiating for a vineyard that was never theirs to negotiate for. And in 18 days, in front of 150 guests, a county investigator named Frank Doyle standing quietly among the crowd, and a folder considerably thicker than the one Miriam Sato had first shown me, they were going to learn exactly how completely they had failed. But there was one more piece I needed before that day arrived. One more conversation I had been dreading more than any other, because it involved someone I had spent 30 years trying not to disappoint, even as she spent 30 years disappointing me in return. I needed to see my mother alone. I drove to my parents' house on a gray Tuesday afternoon in early October, 11 days before the harvest celebration, and I found Diane alone in her garden, cutting the last of the season's roses with the particular precise attention she brought to every activity that could be observed and admired by others. She looked up when she heard my car, and something flickered across her face, quickly suppressed, that might have been fear, or might have been the particular discomfort of a woman confronting, for a moment, the possibility that her victim had grown teeth. "Claire," she said, setting down her shears, "I wasn't expecting you." "I wanted to talk," I said, "before the harvest celebration. Just us." We sat on the patio, in the same chairs where I had spent countless childhood afternoons, watching my mother entertain guests while I waited, unnoticed, for a scrap of her attention. And I asked her, directly, the question I had never once had the courage to ask in 34 years. "Do you know what was in that syringe, or that glass, or whatever it was you and Preston used, Mother? Do you know what it actually did to my body that night?" Diane's face went carefully blank, the practiced blankness of a woman who has spent a lifetime deciding what to feel based on who might be watching. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "You collapsed, Claire. You've been under enormous strain." "The toxicology report says otherwise," I said, keeping my voice level, the way Miriam had coached me, the way I had practiced in the mirror more times than I would ever admit. "It says a benzodiazepine sedative at a concentration inconsistent with anything except deliberate administration. Someone put it in my wine, Mother. And I have a text message from Dr. Halloway to Preston, 16 days before the gala, discussing exactly how to make sure, and I'm quoting directly, that I had enough wine in me that the confusion would look natural." For the first time in my entire life, I watched my mother's beautiful, practiced composure crack in a moment that was not being performed for anyone. "Preston said it was just a mild sedative," she whispered, her hand rising to her throat. "He said it would just make you tired, confused enough to seem like you needed help. He said no one would get hurt." "I could have died," I said, and I let my voice shake slightly. Not because I was performing for her the way she had always performed for others, but because it was simply true. "Do you understand that? Do you understand what you helped do to your own daughter?" Diane began to cry then, and for one strange, suspended moment, I could not tell whether these tears were the same performed grief she had wept over my body on the flagstone, or something new. Something that might have been genuine horror at what she had allowed herself to participate in. I did not stay to find out. I had not come to forgive her, and I had not come to be forgiven. I had come, I realized as I stood to leave, simply to give her one last chance to tell the truth before the harvest celebration made the truth impossible for any of them to hide from. She did not take it. "You don't understand what it's like," Diane said, her voice rising, the tears already drying into something closer to her old defensive anger. "You don't understand what it's like to watch your son struggle while your daughter succeeds, and to know everyone is quietly judging you for it. We needed the resort money, Claire. Preston needed it. This family needed it." "This family," I said quietly, standing in her garden among the roses she had cut with such careful attention, "drugged me in front of 200 people so my brother could pay off his gambling debts. Say that back to yourself, Mother. Really listen to how it sounds." I left her standing among her roses, and I did not look back. And I want you to know that I felt, driving away from that house, not triumph, not yet, but something quieter and sadder, and in its own way, more freeing than triumph could ever have been. I had spent my entire life waiting for my mother to choose me. That afternoon, in her garden, she had finally, unmistakably, chosen. And for the first time, I stopped waiting. 11 days remained before the harvest celebration, and in those 11 days, everything that had been quietly assembling itself for weeks, the trust documents, the toxicology report, the locksmith's invoice, the text message, the draft petition, the investigator's file on Dr. Halloway, Frank Doyle's quiet promise to be present, would finally come together into something my family could not spin, could not soften, and could not survive with their reputations, their freedom, or their fantasy of my fragility intact. They believed the harvest celebration would be the moment I finally, formally handed them everything. They had absolutely no idea it would be the moment I took it all back. The morning of the harvest celebration arrived crisp and clear, the particular blue-skied cold of a California October that makes the turning vine leaves look almost lit from within, gold and rust and deep burgundy stretching down the hillside in long, orderly rows. I stood at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands, watching the crew set up the long tables in the courtyard. The same courtyard where 5 weeks earlier, I had collapsed in front of 200 witnesses, believing, for one terrible swimming moment, that I had already lost. Matteo found me there around 8, letting himself in through the back door the way he had for years, and set a folder on the counter beside my coffee. The physical copy of everything we had gathered, duplicated 3 times over, and stored in 3 separate locations, because Miriam had insisted, correctly, that a woman who plans to expose a conspiracy should never allow her only evidence to exist in a single vulnerable place. "Doyle called this morning," Matteo said. "He'll be here by 2, dressed casual, mixing with the crowd. Says he doesn't want anyone noticing him until it matters." "And Renata Cole?" "Already positioned. She's posing as a wine club member. Arrived early. Been chatting up your mother's friends for 20 minutes already." I nodded slowly, feeling the strange, suspended calm that settles over you in the final hours before something long prepared finally arrives. Emma came downstairs around 9, dressed simply, her hair pulled back, and she hugged me tightly at the bottom of the stairs, longer than usual. And neither of us said anything for a long moment. "You ready?" she finally asked. "I've been ready for 4 years," I told her. I just didn't know it yet. My family arrived at 1:30, nearly an hour before most guests, exactly as I had anticipated, because Walter Ashworth has never in his life been late to collect something he believed already belonged to him. He wore the same $3,000 tuxedo jacket, absurdly formal for an afternoon harvest event, as if he intended the day to feel, from the very first moment, like a coronation rather than a celebration. My mother wore black, which I noted with a small, cold flicker of something like dark amusement, though whether she had chosen it consciously as mourning for the daughter she believed she was finally subduing, or simply because black photographed well, I never learned and never asked. Preston arrived with Vanessa, and notably with Gordon Beck, the family's silver-haired attorney, carrying a leather portfolio that I knew, without needing to ask, contained the arrangement my father had described over the phone weeks earlier, the document meant to formalize my surrender. Dr. Halloway arrived shortly after, greeting my father with the easy familiarity of men who golf together every Thursday, and I watched him scan the courtyard with a physician's practiced, assessing eye, looking, I understood now, for exactly the kind of confused, unstable behavior he had already written into his notes weeks in advance. he would not find it. I greeted each of them with the same measured, quiet warmth I had used for years, the warmth of a woman conditioned since childhood to make herself small and pleasant, regardless of what simmered underneath. And if my calm unsettled them even slightly, none of them showed it, because they had already decided, collectively, that whatever fragile creature they believed they had broken on that flagstone 5 weeks earlier would simply continue performing fragility indefinitely, right up until the moment she signed whatever they placed in front of her. "You look well," my father said, and there was something almost like suspicion beneath the words, a man recalibrating slightly against an unexpected data point. "I feel well," I said, and smiled. The guests began arriving in earnest around 2, filling the courtyard with the particular warm bustle of a community event. Distributors I had worked with for years, longtime customers who had followed Larkspur Hill since its early days, local press who covered the valley's wine industry with genuine affection, and among them, unremarkable in a plain gray blazer nearly identical to the one she had worn at the September gala, Renata Cole moved easily through the crowd. And somewhere near the back, in jeans and a flannel shirt that made him look like any other local guest, Frank Doyle arrived precisely at 2, exactly as promised. I did not look at him directly. I had promised Miriam I would not. At 3:30, as the afternoon light began its slow amber slant across the vines, my father found me near the small stage that had been set up at the edge of the courtyard, the same stage, in fact, where I had given my toast 5 weeks before. "It's time," he said, and Gordon Beck materialized at his shoulder, leather portfolio in hand, already unclasping it. "Let's get this handled before the announcement. Gordon has the papers ready." "Let's do it up on the stage," I said, "in front of everyone. I think it's important people see the family coming together after everything that happened. Don't you?" I watched my father's face carefully as I said this, and I saw, for just a moment, a flicker of something calculating, weighing whether a public signing served his purposes or not. And then, exactly as I had anticipated, his vanity and his hunger for a witnessed triumph over his difficult daughter won out over any lingering caution. "Yes," he said, "I think that's exactly right." We climbed the small stage together, my father, my mother trailing slightly behind in her funeral black, Preston and Vanessa, Gordon Beck with his leather portfolio, Dr. Halloway drifting closer from the edge of the crowd with the particular anticipatory alertness of a man expecting to be needed soon. The band, a small acoustic trio Larkspur Hill hired every October, quieted at a gesture from Matteo, who had positioned himself, I noticed, close to the small sound system's microphone. 150 guests turned their attention toward the stage, the way a crowd always turns toward the promise of an announcement, and I felt, standing there in the amber afternoon light with my family arranged around me like pieces on a board they believed they were still controlling, the entire weight of 5 weeks of quiet, patient preparation gathering itself into a single held breath. "Thank you all for being here," I began, and my voice, clear and steady over the small sound system, carried easily across the courtyard. 5 weeks ago, at our anniversary gala, many of you watched something happen to me that I know frightened you. It frightened me too. I paused, letting the silence stretch, watching my father's expression shift toward satisfaction, watching Gordon Beck's hand tighten slightly on his leather portfolio, ready to step forward the moment I gave the expected cue. My family told you, that night and in the weeks since, that I had been struggling, that the strain of running this vineyard alone, of losing my husband, of carrying my grandmother's legacy, had finally become too much for me to bear. "They were half right," I said. "Something was too much to bear that night. It just wasn't what they told you." I watched the first flicker of genuine alarm cross my father's face. On September 20th, I continued, my voice level and clear, a benzodiazepine sedative was administered to me without my knowledge or consent, in a glass of wine, at my own anniversary celebration. I did not collapse from strain. I did not collapse from grief. I was drugged, deliberately, by members of my own family, so that a doctor paid to be present that night could falsely certify me as incompetent, and so that a guardianship petition, already drafted weeks in advance, could be filed to seize control of this vineyard. The courtyard had gone entirely silent. 150 faces turned toward the stage in stunned, uncomprehending stillness, and beside me, I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, saw Preston's hand find Vanessa's arm in a grip that had nothing to do with comfort. "Claire," my father said, his voice low and urgent, stepping toward me. "This isn't the time or the place for—" "It's exactly the time and place," I said, turning to face him directly, and I let my voice drop into something quieter, colder, more devastating than any raised shout could ever have been. "You said, 5 weeks ago, kneeling on that flagstone with a pen in your hand, that you just needed a signature. Do you remember what you told everyone standing around us that night, Father? Do you remember the exact words?" He said nothing, his face draining of the ruddy confidence it had carried all afternoon. "She's not well," I said, quoting him back to himself, word for word, exactly as Preston had said it, exactly as I had carried it with me for 5 weeks, waiting for precisely this moment. "She hasn't been well for months. That's what you told 200 people while I lay on the ground, unable to speak for myself." "I have a toxicology report," I continued, my voice never rising, never breaking, exactly as I had practiced. "I have a text message from Dr. Halloway to Preston, dated 16 days before that gala, discussing how to make sure I had, and I quote, enough wine in me that the confusion would look natural. I have a locksmith's invoice showing my father hired someone to duplicate keys to my private office in July, the same month he first proposed selling this land out from under me. I have a draft guardianship petition prepared by Gordon Beck's office dated August 22nd, describing incidents that never happened, dictated by my brother and my mother to a paralegal who has already confirmed, in writing, that she never once observed me exhibiting any of the behaviors described. Gordon Beck had gone very still, his leather portfolio hanging forgotten at his side. "You were never delicate," I said, turning slightly to include my mother in my gaze, and I watched her flinch at the word she herself had wielded against me for 7 years. "That was your word, Mother, delicate. You used it so often I think you actually convinced people it was true. But delicate women don't build 140 acres of award-winning vineyard from a hillside their own father called worthless. Delicate women don't survive a drought, a fire, and a husband's death, and still manage to keep 31 employees paid and a business thriving. You called me delicate because it was useful to you, because it explained, conveniently, why I didn't need my fair share of anything." I could hear the crowd murmuring now, a low, rising wave of shock and disbelief, phones lifting throughout the courtyard, the same phones that had captured my collapse 5 weeks earlier, now capturing something else entirely. "You said I was playing farmer," I said, turning to Preston, and I watched the color drain from his face as he understood in real time exactly how much I knew. "Cosplaying in Grandma's overalls," I believe was the phrase you used at Christmas 3 years ago, in front of your own wife. You said it while you were quietly losing $210,000 on a restaurant that failed within 3 years. You said it while you were building toward $341,000 in debt from a fund that collapsed 18 months ago. You needed $22 million, Preston, and you decided your sister's life was a fair price to pay for it. Preston opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, no rehearsed sentence emerging this time. I want to be very clear, I said, turning back to face the crowd directly, my voice steady and carrying across the stunned silence of the courtyard, about something my family did not know when they planned all of this. Larkspur Hill Vineyards has not been personally owned by me for 4 years. Every acre of this hillside, every vine my grandmother planted with her own hands, belongs to the Eleanor Ashworth Trust, established specifically to protect this legacy from exactly this kind of scheme. Whatever they believed they were seizing that night, whatever signature they forced onto my unconscious hand, it was worthless. You cannot steal what someone no longer personally owns. I let that land, watching my father's face transform in real time, the ruddy confidence collapsing into something gray and stunned, a man realizing in front of 150 witnesses that his entire scheme had targeted a vault that had been empty for years. They drugged me, I said, for nothing. They hired a doctor with a documented history of falsifying incapacity findings for nothing. They forged a petition full of lies for nothing. Everything they did, every cruel word, every performed tear, every rehearsed sentence, was in service of stealing something that was never theirs to take. I turned to Dr. Halloway then, who had gone very pale near the edge of the stage, clearly calculating his options, and I said only, quietly, "There's an investigator named Frank Doyle standing in this crowd right now, Doctor. He's been building a file on you for months, quite independent of anything I did. 3 other families, 3 other conservatorship cases. I imagine he'd like to speak with you." I watched Frank Doyle step forward from the crowd then, unhurried, showing a badge to the small circle of guests nearest him, and I watched Dr. Holloway's face go from pale to ashen. And I watched him take one small, involuntary step backward, as if putting distance between himself and the stage might somehow undo everything he had already done. The courtyard had gone entirely, completely silent now. 150 guests holding their breath, phones still recording. The golden October light slanting long and low across the vines, exactly as it had 5 weeks before. And in that silence, I turned to my father one final time, and I said the words I had been carrying, carefully, patiently, for 5 weeks. "You called me delicate my entire life," I said. "Delicate enough to fool, delicate enough to control, delicate enough that you believed, right up until this very moment, that I would simply lie back down on that flagstone and let you take everything I built." "You were wrong," I said. "Not delicate enough to break. Never delicate enough to break." The silence that followed felt, to me, standing on that small stage in the amber light with my family arranged around me like pieces on a board they no longer controlled, like the exact sound of a trap, finally, completely closing. What happened next unfolded with a speed that surprised even me, though Miriam had warned me, weeks earlier, that once the truth was exposed publicly and completely, the collapse would come far faster than the years of quiet cruelty that had preceded it. Gordon Beck was the first to move, and not toward my father, but away from him, stepping back from the small circle on the stage with the swift, practiced instinct of a man who has spent a career recognizing exactly when a client has become a liability rather than an asset. "I want to state, for the record," Gordon said, his voice suddenly formal, addressing no one in particular and everyone at once, "that I drafted that petition based on information represented to me as factual by my clients. If any of the underlying claims were fabricated, that is a matter entirely separate from my own conduct." It was, I thought, watching him extract himself with such practiced smoothness, almost impressive. The speed with which a man who had spent weeks helping construct a fraudulent legal document suddenly discovered his own innocence the moment the fraud became public. Frank Doyle had reached the stage by then, moving with the unhurried authority of a man who had done this many times before, and he addressed Dr. Holloway first, his voice calm but carrying easily in the stunned silence of the courtyard. "Dr. Holloway," he said, "I'd like you to come with me to discuss some questions about your certification practices. You're not under arrest at this time, but I do need you to understand that the State Medical Board will be receiving a formal complaint regarding at least 4 cases, including tonight's." 4 cases. Not 3. I would learn in the following weeks that Renata Cole had uncovered a 4th conservatorship case in the days just before the harvest celebration. One Doyle's team had not yet connected, involving an elderly widower in a neighboring county whose family had used almost the exact same scheme, the same rehearsed collapse, the same conveniently early doctor, to seize control of a modest but valuable piece of commercial property. Dr. Holloway did not argue. He did not protest his innocence, or demand a lawyer, or attempt any of the outraged denials I had half expected from a man who had built his career on quiet, careful fraud. He simply nodded, his face gray and defeated, and allowed Frank Doyle to lead him down from the stage and through the stunned, parting crowd, past guests who stared at him with the particular disgusted fascination reserved for a man exposed. My father was next, and his collapse, when it came, was not the dignified, businesslike retreat I might have expected from a man who had built his entire life on projecting unshakable confidence. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight and desperate, and hissed, low enough that only those of us on the stage could hear. "You have no idea what you've just done," Walter said, and his voice, for the first time in my entire life, shook. "Everyone we know is standing right there, Claire. Everyone." "I know exactly what I've done," I said, removing his hand from my arm with a calm, deliberate motion. "I've told the truth, in front of everyone we know, for the first time in this family's history. You should try it sometime, Father. It's remarkably freeing." He stared at me for a long moment, his face working through something I had never seen on it before. Not anger exactly, though anger was certainly present, but something closer to a man realizing in real time that the daughter he had spent her entire life underestimating had, at some point he never noticed, become someone he could no longer control or predict or overpower. "I gave you everything," he said finally, and there was something almost pleading in it now, the first genuine vulnerability I had ever heard in my father's voice. "The business sense, the toughness. Where do you think you learned to fight like this?" "I learned it from Grandma Eleanor," I said. "On a hillside you called worthless, that I turned into $14 million, that you tried to steal by drugging me in front of 200 people. I didn't learn a single thing about fighting from you, Father. I learned from you exactly what I refused to become." He had no answer for that. He simply stood there in his absurd, formal tuxedo jacket as the crowd around the stage began to disperse into small, murmuring clusters, some drifting toward exits, others lingering to watch the spectacle unfold with the particular fascinated horror of witnesses to a genuine scandal. My mother, when I turned to her, was crying, and this time, watching her closely, I believed, for the first time, that the tears were real, stripped, finally, of performance, because there was no longer any audience left worth performing for, only the daughter she had spent 30 years failing to see clearly. "I was scared," Diane said, her voice small and cracked in a way I had genuinely never heard before. "Preston was drowning, Claire, and I couldn't watch my son fail again. I told myself it wouldn't really hurt you. I told myself you'd understand eventually that it was for the family. There is no family that drugs its own daughter, I said, and I kept my voice gentle, because whatever cruelty she had shown me, some small, tired part of me still did not want to watch my mother break entirely in front of 100 guests. There's just people who share blood and call it love because the word is convenient. I turned to Preston last, and he had said nothing throughout the entire unraveling, his face pale and slack, Vanessa already several steps away from him, her expression unreadable, calculating, the expression of a woman rapidly recalculating exactly how much of her own future she wanted attached to a man now facing possible criminal charges for conspiracy and fraud. "You said I was cosplaying," I said quietly, "in Grandma's overalls. Do you remember what she used to say, Preston? About people who underestimate what they can't be bothered to understand." He shook his head slowly, his eyes wet, his mouth working without producing sound. "She said let them," I told him. "It leaves you room to work. I let you underestimate me for 7 years, Preston, and I used every single day of it." I stepped down from the stage then, into a courtyard gone strange and quiet in the golden afternoon light, past guests who parted for me the way a crowd parts for someone they no longer quite know how to categorize. Not the fragile, struggling woman they had watched collapse 5 weeks earlier, and not quite the cold, avenging figure some small, uncharitable corner of their minds might have wanted to see instead, but something steadier than either. A woman who had simply, finally, told the truth in the one place her family had never expected her to have the courage to tell it. Emma found me near the edge of the courtyard, by the old stone wall that marked the boundary of Eleanor's original 3 acres, and she wrapped her arms around me without a word. And we stood like that for a long moment, listening to the murmur of a scandal unfolding behind us. The particular sound of a family's reputation collapsing in real time. "It's done," I said, into her hair, and I felt her nod against my shoulder. But it was not entirely done. Not yet. There was still the matter of what happened to my father, my mother, my brother, and Dr. Halloway in the weeks that followed. And there was still, waiting quietly for me at the top of the hillside where Eleanor had once knelt to plant her first stubborn vines, the question of what kind of life I intended to build. In the wreckage of everything my family's greed had tried, and ultimately failed, to take from me. The weeks that followed the harvest celebration moved with the particular strange velocity of a scandal working its way through a small community. Faster in some ways than I had expected, slower and more painful in others. And I want to tell you honestly, because this story deserves honesty, even in its most satisfying moments, that watching my family collapse did not feel entirely like triumph. It felt, more often, like grief with victory sitting uncomfortably beside it. 2 emotions that did not cancel each other out so much as simply learn, slowly, to occupy the same space. Dr. Richard Halloway's medical license was suspended within 3 weeks, pending a formal state board investigation that ultimately substantiated not 4, but 6 separate cases of falsified incapacity certifications spanning nearly a decade. Each one, Frank Doyle's team discovered, tied to a family with significant assets and a relative willing to pay handsomely for a diagnosis that served their interests rather than the truth. He surrendered his license permanently the following spring. Rather than face a hearing he had no realistic chance of winning. And the last I heard of him, he had moved out of state entirely. His golfing partnership with my father, along with every other relationship built on his decade of quiet fraud, having evaporated the moment the truth became public. Gordon Beck, for his part, managed to avoid formal disbarment through a combination of careful legal maneuvering and the genuine, if narrow, defense that he had drafted the petition based on information he claimed to believe was accurate. He was not, in the end, charged criminally, though the County Bar Association issued a formal censure, and his client list, once populated by some of the valley's wealthiest families, thinned considerably in the months that followed, as word spread of exactly what kind of documents his office had been willing to produce without asking hard enough questions about the truth behind them. Preston's collapse was the most complete, and in some ways, the most difficult for me to watch, despite everything he had done. The criminal investigation into the conspiracy to defraud, built on the toxicology report, the text messages, the draft petition, and Dr. Holloway's eventual cooperation with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence on his own charges, resulted in Preston pleading guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud and administering a controlled substance without consent, a plea that carried, ultimately, a sentence of 18 months, most of which, given the nature of the offense and his lack of any prior record, was served in a minimum security facility roughly 90 minutes from the Valley. Vanessa filed for divorce 4 months before Preston's sentencing hearing, and I heard, through the same grapevine that had once carried whispers of my father's conservatorship loan inquiry to my cousin Renata, that she had already begun seeing someone new within the year, someone considerably wealthier and considerably less encumbered by criminal proceedings. And I felt, hearing this, not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of tired confirmation of something I had always privately suspected about the foundation their marriage had been built on. My father's decline was slower, and, in its own way, more thorough. He was not charged criminally himself, largely because the evidence tying him directly to the drugging, as opposed to the guardianship scheme and the locksmith's suspicious July invoice, remained circumstantial enough that the district attorney's office ultimately declined to pursue charges against him personally, a decision I received with more ambivalence than relief. But the civil consequences were severe. Miriam Sato, on my behalf, pursued and won a civil judgment against both my parents for damages related to the conspiracy, a judgment that, combined with the legal fees accumulated defending against both the civil suit and the criminal investigation into Preston and Dr. Holloway, consumed nearly all of my parents' liquid savings within 18 months. They sold the house with the garden where my mother had wept over her roses. They moved to a smaller condominium 2 towns over, and the country club membership my mother had guarded so fiercely for 30 years quietly lapsed, unrenewed, because there was no longer money left over for the dues, and, I suspect, because the particular circle of women my mother had spent decades performing for no longer wanted her at their table, now that the performance had been so publicly and permanently exposed. I did not gloat over any of this. I want to be honest about that. There were nights, in the year that followed, when I sat alone on the porch of the farmhouse and felt something closer to sorrow than satisfaction, mourning not the parents who had drugged me, but the parents I had spent 34 years hoping, against all evidence, that I might someday have. But grief, as I told Emma in that kitchen weeks before the harvest celebration, does not have to be the last word. The Vantage Hospitality Group deal, unsurprisingly, collapsed entirely once the conspiracy became public, their attorney sending a curt, carefully worded letter withdrawing the offer within a week of the harvest celebration, citing, without ever using the actual words, a desire to distance the company from any association with fraud, coercion, or criminal conspiracy. I have often wondered whether they would have proceeded with the $22 million purchase at all, had my family's scheme somehow succeeded, or whether the entire hillside would have become, within a few years, exactly the resort my father had envisioned in that tasting room meeting. 60 rooms and a spa and an event lawn where my grandmother's vines used to grow. It does not matter now. The hillside remains exactly what Eleanor Ashworth built it to be, rocky and stubborn and quietly extraordinary, and it will remain that way for as long as the trust that protects it continues to exist. Which is to say, given how carefully Miriam Sato constructed it, essentially forever. I want to tell you about one more conversation before I close this story, because I think it matters more than any of the consequences that fell on my family in the months that followed. It happened roughly a year after the harvest celebration, on a quiet October afternoon nearly identical to the one where everything had finally come apart, when I drove, alone, to the small condominium where my mother now lived, and knocked on her door for the first time since that conversation in her garden among the roses. She looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow, the particular diminishment of a woman whose armor has been stripped away and never replaced with anything else underneath. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Diane said, standing in the doorway, not inviting me in, as if she understood, correctly, that she had not yet earned the right to have me inside whatever space she now called home. "I just wanted you to know that I understand, now, exactly what I did. I've had a lot of time to sit with it." "I don't forgive you," I said. And I said it gently, because there was no cruelty left in me by then, only a tired, clear-eyed honesty. "Not yet. Maybe not ever, completely. But I don't hate you either, Mother. I think, for now, that has to be enough for both of us." She nodded, tears sliding down her face without the performance that had once accompanied every tear she shed in my presence, and I turned and walked back to my car. And I did not look back, not because I was angry, but because I had, finally, after 35 years, stopped needing to see whether she was watching me leave. I have not spoken to my father since the harvest celebration. I understand from Emma, who maintains a cautious, limited relationship with her grandmother, but none at all with her grandfather, that he has grown smaller in every sense, his health declining, his old confidence replaced by a kind of bitter, quiet resentment he directs at everyone except himself. I do not know if that will ever change. I have stopped waiting to find out. Preston was released after 14 months, given credit for good behavior, and I understand he now works for a friend's landscaping company 2 counties over, a job considerably humbler than anything he ever imagined for himself, though I have heard, through Renata, that he has stopped drinking, stopped gambling, and has begun, slowly, tentatively, to rebuild something resembling an honest life. I do not know whether I will ever fully forgive him either, but I hope, for his sake, and for the sake of whatever family he might someday rebuild for himself, that the humbling proves to be the making of him rather than simply the ending. As for me, and for Larkspur Hill, and for Emma, who graduated the following spring and came home to the valley with her enology degree in hand and a fierce, quiet determination to learn every inch of the hillside her great-grandmother had planted, the story that follows is, I am glad to say, considerably less dramatic than everything that came before it. Emma moved into the small cottage where I had lived alone since David died. The same cottage Vantage Hospitality Group had once wanted to bulldoze for their resort's finest suites, and she began working the vines alongside Matteo, learning the same patient, listening quiet he had taught me 30 years earlier, learning it, I think, even faster than I had, because she came to it without the particular wound of having spent her childhood being told she was too delicate for the work. We harvested a record crop the autumn after the trial concluded, 140 acres yielding fruit so rich in color and mineral complexity that our winemaker called it, without exaggeration, the finest vintage Larkspur Hill had ever produced. We named it, with Miriam Sato's careful legal blessing and Emma's enthusiastic insistence, the Eleanor Reserve, and it sold out within 4 months of release, collected by exactly the kind of discerning buyers who had once dismissed a rocky hillside as worthless, and who now understood, finally and completely, exactly what had been growing there all along. I think about my grandmother often, especially in the early mornings during harvest, when the fog still sits low over the valley floor, and the only sound is the soft crunch of boots between the rows. And I think, most often, about the things she told me on that overturned crate at the edge of the North Block, all those summers ago when I was 14 years old and did not yet understand what kind of woman I would need to become. They will always underestimate what they cannot be bothered to understand. Let them. It leaves you room to work. I have thought, in the years since that harvest celebration, about what it means to be underestimated. And I have come to believe, with a certainty I did not have as a younger woman, that being underestimated is not a wound, though it can certainly feel like one, especially when the people doing the underestimating are the ones who are supposed to love you most. Being underestimated is, if you survive it with your integrity and your competence intact, an advantage that very few people ever choose to hand you voluntarily. It is a gift disguised as a cruelty. It is room to work, exactly as Eleanor said. And the only real question, the only question that ever actually mattered, was what I intended to build in that room while no one else was paying attention. I built a wall no one could see, standing exactly where my family expected an open door. I built it slowly, quietly, over 4 years, long before I understood exactly what it would someday need to protect against. And when the moment finally came, when my own father knelt on cold flagstone and pressed a pen into my drugged and unsteady hand, believing with his whole ambitious heart that he had just taken everything from me, that wall held, exactly as it was built to hold, and the trap closed around the very people who thought they were the ones setting it. If there is a lesson in this story, and I believe there is, though I want to offer it to you gently rather than as some triumphant sermon, it is this. The people who count on your compliance, who call you delicate or difficult or fragile or foolish, are very often counting on the fact that you have never once considered building anything they cannot see. Silence, in the right hands, is not weakness. It is strategy. Preparation, quiet and patient and unglamorous, done long before anyone believes it will ever be needed, is very often the only thing standing between you and the people who assume your gentleness means you have nothing underneath it worth protecting. I do not believe in revenge. Not really. Not the cold, sadistic kind that some people mistake for justice. What I believe in is consequence, clearly seen, honestly named, and allowed, finally, to land exactly where it belongs. My family built an elaborate, cruel scheme to steal a hillside my grandmother planted with her own bare hands. And in the end, the only thing their scheme accomplished was to reveal, to everyone who had ever doubted me, exactly how much I had already built to protect it. Larkspur Hill Vineyards is thriving. Emma is thriving, learning every season what her great-grandmother taught me one summer at a time. Learning it in the sunlight, rather than the shadow of anyone's disapproval. Mateo still checks the tractor's oil by the light of that same bare bulb in the equipment barn, and still says very little, and still notices everything. And I trust him with my life, exactly as I did the day he first said the word guardianship out loud, and gave me the room I needed to understand what was coming. And I am thriving too, in a life considerably quieter and considerably more honest than the one my family spent 7 years quietly trying to convince me I deserved. If you have ever been called too delicate, too sensitive, too difficult, too much, or not enough, by the very people who were supposed to protect you, I hope this story has told you something you needed to hear. I hope it has told you that the quiet, patient work of protecting what matters to you, done long before anyone believes you capable of it, is never wasted. Even when it feels, for years at a time, like nothing more than paperwork gathering dust in a drawer. I hope it has told you that being underestimated is not the end of your story. It is very often, if you are patient and clear-eyed enough to use it, the beginning of the only story that actually matters, the one where you finally stop waiting to be seen and simply become impossible to overlook. If you have ever had to stand up to your own family to protect something they never believed you were capable of protecting, I would love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this one meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own quiet strength, or your own hidden preparation, or your own long overdue moment of finally being taken seriously, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like mine still to tell, and I would be glad to have you along for the next one. My grandmother built something extraordinary out of land everyone told her was worthless. I built a wall no one could see to protect it. And when my family finally came looking for the fragile daughter they had spent 30 years describing to anyone who would listen, all they found, standing quietly in her place, was a woman who had simply, finally, stopped being anyone's easy target. That is not the end of the story. That is only, at last, the true beginning of it.